Good morning, everybody, and welcome to 2020. And the first thing we're going to talk about today is Warlock, because while Warlock did come out 5 years ago, which kind of seems crazy at this point, it's something that a lot of people know is one of the best and easiest classes to solo with. Sure, there might be some things about Warlock that people find boring, like how you kind of don't have to worry about your damage type because you bypass pretty much all sorts of different immunities thanks to doing force or evil damage. All of the temporary hit points and very, very powerful crowd control abilities kind of allowing you to just breeze through. Some people find Warlock very boring. I personally have always found Warlock to be pretty interesting because it gives you so many different options in combat. You can choose whether you want to be a blaster Warlock, or a melee, or a throw-in, or like some type of weird crossbow using repeating crossbows, or even mixing with Inquisitive. You can go all crowd control. You can do so many different crazy things with Warlock, and I think that's totally awesome. The fact that that's a valid playstyle at all is really, really interesting to me, and that there's so many different things you can do with Warlock, I kind of love it. However, this video is not going to be talking about kind of like the crazy different things you can do with Warlock. This video is actually going to be talking about the basics, because a lot of people get confused about how Warlock is supposed to function. How do you build a Warlock? What are the core stats that you need? And what are the things that make Warlock so good? I've seen many people just kind of not really fully understand a lot of the systems, because unlike some other aspects of DDO, it's not really intuitive how the class works, especially because the wording is all over the place. So with this video, I hope to show you guys some of the basics of Warlock. If you happen to have already played Warlock before, you might not learn anything from this video, but don't worry, I will be diving into some of the more finer details of Warlock and really pushing some of the boundaries at a later time. So I'm going to throw it over to me, who will detail out exactly how Warlock works and how to build, play, and stat out your Warlock. Okay, so now what we're going to be doing is looking at all the different effects of Warlock and kind of detailing out how Warlock scales off of stuff, how it's supposed to work, so that way maybe you've heard from somebody that Warlock is a really good character to play, it's easy for leveling, but you haven't had that experience yourself. You'll be able to see that here and experience like how you're supposed to be building the character so you can become a little bit more successful. So let's start out with what is a Warlock. Well, a Warlock's a spellcaster, first and foremost. So, like, I can attack stuff, and I have the ability to attack, but at the end of the day, Warlock is designed for blasting things. I'm supposed to shoot out my Eldritch Blast. Now, problematically, Eldritch Blast is actually labeled as an attack, and that's very confusing because it's not an attack, it's a spell, and attacks and spells are treated very, very differently. So we're going to kind of go over this right now. So, when you make an attack against a monster, you use your attack stats. So right here I have the Celestial Beacon as my weapon. It's plus 20 to hit. It does a d6 plus 11 damage when I swing my weapon. So if I use my Eldritch Blast, I completely ignore these stats. Even though it says turn your attack into a magical cone and you think it's still an attack, it's not. And it even says this cone attack has a standard range. It's not an attack. It's almost like every time I am pressing this, I am casting a spell. So the actual attack stats on a weapon don't matter. So this Celestial Beacon that's right here is, what is it? It's plus 3, so it gives plus 3 to hit and damage. That doesn't give me plus 3 to hit and damage because, again, I'm shooting out an energy blast. So I don't actually need to worry about the different like physical stats on the item. Another example would be like this Muckbane. This Muckbane has lesser Oozebane on it, so if I happen to equip this, it says does an extra d6 damage against oozes. If I equip it, and then I start Eldritch Blasting oozes, I'm not going to deal additional damage against oozes, because that only applies to actual hits with the weapon. But my weapon never makes contact, so most weapon stats aren't going to affect your Eldritch Blast. This means if you have something that gives you like extra fire damage, or extra cold damage, or extra crit chance, all of those things are not going to apply unless they say the word spell in front of them. So, for example, I don't know if I have another item right here. Yeah, I do. I have this item right here, the Scepter of Impulse. This scepter gives Impulse 43. It gives 43 equipment bonus to the force spell power and also physical spell powers, as well as kinetic lore, increasing my force, physical, and untyped spells to get 6% extra crit chance. So this is all spell stuff on a weapon, and that is what affects my Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast, while it might be an attack, it is in fact a spell more than anything else. So this is a spell. So that's important. Keep that in mind. Now, how do your Want to keep track of your spell powers? Well, you can keep track of your spell power here. You can see it in this little menu next to where you have your spell points. So you can see I've got light spell power, I have force, I have acid, I have a whole bunch of kinds. You got the spell critical chance. That's what's going to be scaling your damage. Now, of course, you can play as a melee warlock if you like. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the most important thing, as I said, is making sure that you're grabbing the right type of spell power for your actual warlock abilities. So let's take a look at that really quick. So if you are using a Eldritch Blast, I'm actually going to look at it in the feat manual just so that it's a little bit clearer, because I find the one down there is a little transparent. Eldritch Blast right here. It's kind of hard to see, but it says turn into your basic attack into a magical bolt, dealing a d6 force damage. It even tells you it scales off of spell power, and it says 130% spell power, which means it scales even harder than regular spells. Regular spells scale 100% off of spell power. This is 130%. So which means if you have 100 spell power, it's treated as having 130. For a point of reference, if you're new and you don't even know what spell power does, spell power increases your damage by a percentage. So if I have 200, I have right here, I've got 151 force spell power, then I'm going to increase my damage on my force spells by 151%. It's a 1-to-1 ratio on percentage. So, you know, if I was doing 10 damage with 151 force spell power, I'm actually doing, if I was doing 10, I'd be doing 200, or not 250, 25 damage, about, which is nice. The Eldritch Blast scales higher than that, so it scales 130%. So instead, you would be looking at 1.3% extra damage per spell power instead of 1%, which is really, really nice. So you're scaling everything off of your force spell power. That is the base damage of your blast. When you shoot, that's this blast thing right here, this purple beam that I'm shooting out, this is just force damage, and that is all that you're dealing. Now, every Warlock gets to choose a pact as well, and the pact not only gives them special spells, but it also gives them additional damage in all their Warlock blasts. I chose the Great Old One, which adds acid damage, so if I click this and I get down and I make a sacrifice, I guess that's what that looks like, my blast changes color. It is now green, and it's dealing acid damage and force damage. You always deal the base damage of your Eldritch Blast, and you always get your pact damage as well, as long as your pact damage is turned on. So when you deal damage, you're going to be getting two different numbers showing up, the force damage and the pact damage on top of that. If you pick Fey Pact, you get Sonic. If you pick Fiend Pact, you get Fire. Now the base damage, the force, can't be resisted. That's like your force of will just slamming into a target. They always take the damage. But all the other stuff, the fire, the acid, or the sonic, can be resisted and has a save, which you can read in the Pact DC description here. The save is going to be based on 19 plus your charisma modifier plus any evocation bonuses you have, so it's basically just treated as a 9th level spell, as of another class, an evocation spell, so you want to make sure you're getting evocation bonuses on items to increase the DC of your spell. But on top of that, it's also a different save based on the Pact. If you pick Great Old One like I did, it's against the monster's will saves. Monsters tend to have lower will saves depending on the monster. Like some monsters, like Black Abishai, have insanely high will saves. Some monsters, like ogres, fail every time. Then you've got the Fortitude saves, which is Fiend Pact. Now, a lot of monsters have high Fortitude saves to prevent things like instant death effects from killing them. So you got to be careful about the Fiend Pact and the fire damage. And then the Fey Pact has sonic damage, and their sonic damage is saved against reflex. Since it's a reflex save, monsters with evasion, if they make the reflex saves, they take 0 damage. So I generally don't like to take the Fey Pact, just because I like to avoid the actual, damage or mitigation by just using Great Old One. So even if a monster makes their save, I'm still doing half of my damage, which is something, to say the least. So, cool, I started out, I've got my Eldritch Blast. But how do I make it even better? So, as I said, you're going to want to be picking up items that give you the right spell powers. So, my Eldritch Blast does force damage, I know that, so I've got my Force Scepter right here that's going to give me this extra force spell power, and I've got these acid boots right here, the rock boots that give me acid spell power and acid lore. So I've got extra acid crit, spell power, force crit, spell power, and then I'm just going to be kicking ass. However, there are ways you can augment and change your Eldritch Blast, and we're going to take a quick look at that to make it more versatile. So, to start out, depending on which of the enhancement trees you decide to specialize in, you can pick their signature blast style. So if you decide to be a Soul Eater, instead of getting the regular Eldritch Blast where you just kind of shoot out, instead you can turn on the Cone, where you deal a cone. Now unfortunately I'm a halfling, and so the cone is closer to the floor than it's supposed to be because it's not coded properly, but basically it's supposed to be coming out here. That's funny. I didn't realize that was wrong on halflings. I'm always looking at it from the back where you don't really notice the problem. But anyway, you can shoot in a cone, so it's going to be hitting multiple targets directly in front of you. You can use the Tainted Scholar to use the chain, where after you shoot out your Eldritch Blast, it hits a target and then it chains to monsters that are behind it, like it ricochets through a whole crowd of monsters. You can also use the Enervating Shadow, which is simply the single target focused blast. However, it's a little slower, but it's got homing, so it'll curve with monsters and follow them, which is really nice as long as you have them targeted, and it drains negative levels. So if you're going single target, it's basically the same if you're all single target because you get to drain levels. Or you have the Enlightened Spirit Eldritch Aura, where while it is active, it is just pulsing out from you, and you don't have to do anything, you don't have to turn anything, it just does the damage automatically every 5 seconds to anybody that's standing next to you. If you have the aura active, the nice thing about that is your weapons are free. So if you wanted to try playing a melee warlock, or a ranged warlock with like crossbows or a bow or something, you can use the Enlightened Spirit tree to still get your Eldritch Blast damage to happen, because monsters that will stand next to you will just take the damage, and you have your attacks, your arms free. You cannot have the aura going and also be using one of the blast shapes like the cone. The aura is its own blast shape, so it will override that. So you can't blast while having the aura going, which is why some people like to split up their tree. So you can kind of change it up. Important thing to note is that if you choose one of the more exotic blast shapes, like you choose either cone or chain, they are powerful. However, you do less packed damage with the cone, so -1 packed damage die. So you just do a little bit less of that packed damage, whether it's acid, fire, or sonic, while you have cone active. And the same thing with chain, you do a little bit less packed damage as well. Also, because chain is super versatile and very, very convenient for clearing out packs because it bounces around corners, it can hit guys you can't even see, it also scales only 95% off spell power, which means that if you happen to have chain, and let's just say you do 100 damage with your normal Eldritch Blast, your chain's only going to be doing about like 79-ish, like 78 damage per hit. You're doing a little bit less damage, but you can hit targets that are really far away from each other, whereas cone, you kind of only gotta hit guys that are directly in front of you. And that's kind of how you augment your blasts. Important to note is that your Eldritch Blasts are not affected by metamagic feats. So I have the feat Maximize here. Maximize affects spells, and while these are spells, having Maximize turned on will not affect them because they're not, I can't right click this shape and apply a spell to it. It's not the same thing. However, Warlock does have a lot of spell-like abilities, like Consume or Stricken, which you can apply metamagic feats to, which deal chaotic damage. It's got the Eldritch Wave, which is a big kind of like Eldritch Blast attack. And actually, I think I'll use this opportunity to talk about the big blasts. So each tree gets their own, not only unique style, whether it's the cone, the chain, the aura, whatever, but you also get these big attacks that use your Eldritch Blast damage as the creator of the attack. So for Soul Eater, you get Eldritch Wave. It's a big cone that just goes like boom, 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 and hits, it says it does 3 times. It only hits twice, but it scales with 150% spell power, so it's even harder hitting than regular hits. And because this is its own spell-like ability, where it's a button you press and your guy just does a thing, you can apply Maximize and Power and all these other things. And because they scale even harder off of spell power, this is 150% spell power, well, Maximize usually adds an extra 150 spell power. So this is going to be like adding 225 spell power, which is like adding 225% damage. Like, that's crazy. That's so much extra damage. So the wave is really good as like a big burst attack. Or if you're a Tainted Scholar, you get Eldritch Ball, which is basically like a fireball. But again, same thing, scales 150% spell power. So instead of like shooting out your Eldritch Blast, you go and throw out a fireball that explodes, doing a bunch of extra damage in a good area because it's a ball, so you can hit like a bunch of guys when you enter a room or something. You can apply all your meta magic feats to it, giving it a crazy damage boost at no additional cost, and it's very, very versatile. Or if you're an Enlightened Spirit, you can use the Eldritch Burst, which adds a d6 of light damage, and it's a burst from you, so your guy like literally goes like and shoots that out of your bottom of your pants. And the Spirit Blast, which adds 4d6 light damage. Both these things only scale with 100% spell power. They used to scale with 150% spell power and do way more damage, but then everybody was just using the Enlightened Spirit tree, because this is also the tank tree. So, yeah. Anyway, that's pretty much all you need to know about Warlocks and spell power. If you'd like to still hit people with your weapons, and you don't want to be using your Eldritch Blast, that's also a perfectly valid way to play Warlock. Just keep in mind, if you're planning on using the Eldritch Blast, you need to get the spell damage. So if I'm going to be shooting at monsters, I want Force spell power, and I also want to be picking up the spell power for my Pact, whether it's the Acid Pact, the Fiend Pact, or the Fey Pact for the Sonic. So one of those three. Where I'll leave this is that you can also change the base damage of your Eldritch Blast. So instead of having Force damage, you can pick up Underdark Blast, which changes it to evil. Now, the big difference is Force damage is going to apply to every single target, and it will not be absorbed or resisted until you reach Helmed Horrors, which I think are the only creatures that absorb Force damage. So when you get to Helmed Horrors in Evening Star, then you might run into a problem, but Force damage is pretty versatile for the most part. It lands on basically everything. Underdark Blast, as far as I can tell, is unresisted by all monsters in the entire game. It says it's evil damage, so you would think that it would deal damage to enemies, if it would ignore evil creatures. So say you shoot a demon with it, it won't hurt them. But no, this hurts everything, and it is regarded by most to be the most powerful Blast Essence stance. So instead of doing Force damage, now you're doing Evil. So this character, currently, instead of doing Force and Acid, I do Evil and Acid as my Eldritch Blast damage. So keep that in mind. Evil damage scales off of Light spell power, because Light controls your alignment spell power. So keep that in mind. So I use that. You can also change it to piercing damage as well with Penetrating Blast. This one's really interesting because now that it's piercing instead of Force damage or evil damage, it allows it to have a couple neat properties. So it's still pretty versatile, and you'll almost never run into a scenario where there's a bad thing for piercing damage. But monsters that are resistant to piercing damage, like skeletons, will actually take less damage from your Penetrating Blast, which is important. Also, monsters that are resistant to piercing damage, like Stone Guards, will take less damage. Stone Guard champions, they will take less damage from your piercing damage. However, because Penetrating Blast is actually piercing and not Force, it's not magical, it's a physical attack, which means you can hit golems with it for full damage. Golems are 50% resistant to all magic. In pen and paper, they're immune, but that's not the point. In DDO, they take half damage. But if you have Penetrating Blast, you just go boom, 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 and that golem's taken full damage from every single strike. So it's still very valuable and useful. If you're planning on going deep into the Tainted Scholar tree, I recommend you pick up Penetrating Blast. Also because in a lot of those cases, it deals an extra d6 Eldritch Blast damage, so it's actually not only changing your damage from Force to piercing, it's also giving you more damage on top of that. Another big thing to keep in mind, though, with this is that piercing damage does scale off of Force, so it uses the same spell power, so you don't have to worry about getting any new ones. And lastly, there are a lot of different spell powers that Warlocks are going to focus on in general, but the main ones are Light, Force, and your Pact damage is. My phone is going off, so I just got distracted. Stricken and Consume, and a lot of the stuff at a Soul Eater, use Chaos damage, which scales off of Light spell power. Steel Life Force, Chaos damage, so it scales off of Light spell power. You've got Tainted Scholar, Underdark Blast, scales off of Light spell power. You have the Enlightened Spirit Light damage, scales off of Light spell power. If you go up the Enlightened Spirit tree, you can get Spiritual Retribution, which adds additional light damage to your attacks or Eldritch Blasts, scaling off of Light spell power. And then you can also get Celestial Spirit, which makes your Eldritch Blast do additional light damage, again, scaling off of Light spell power. So Light spell power can be quite essential. Force is also quite good as well, since Force not only scales your base Eldritch Blast damage if unmodified, but it also scales the damage of your Evard's Black Tentacles, which is a very high damage spell. So that's basically how you want to play and scale Warlocks. Spell damage. Get items that have spell powers on them. If you pick up an item and it says, oh, deals an extra d6 of fire damage, that will not affect your Eldritch Blast, and you want to avoid that. Instead, stick to your spell powers, stick to the spell powers that you decide you're going to use. If you're wondering how to decide to pick a spell power, if you're going deep into the Soul Eater tree, I recommend kind of investing into the Underdark Blast, just to make it so that way you don't have to worry about force spell power at all. And you're focusing mostly on the light spell power for your Stricken, for your Consume. You're focusing on light spell power if you want to take Steel Life Force, and also on light spell power for, of course, the Underdark Blast itself, and then just your Acid spell power that you have here. If you're going mostly into Tainted Scholar, I would then come back the other way. I would say mostly focus on Force. Penetrating Blast does give you a decent amount of extra damage, which is really nice and convenient. And if you're going into Tainted Scholar, which is mostly about crit multiplier and extra damage, getting stuff like an extra 60% crit multiplier from their cores onto all their spells, and getting all that force damage, that's when you're going to want to be investing and going with Raw on the force damage, because then your Evard's Black Tentacles is going to do crazy amounts of damage. And then if you're moving into Enlightened Spirit, again, you're going to want to focus on light spell power. Enlightened Spirit actually gives you a lot of it, giving you 21 here and 21 here, so 42 light spell power for 6 enhancement points, which is a lot. So keep that in mind. Anyways, that's pretty much how you're going to be building and playing and gearing your Warlocks. All of the stuff scales off of Charisma. Oh, that's the last thing I want to touch on. I keep getting distracted. So I've seen people be like, oh yeah, are you going to play an Intelligence or a Charisma-based Warlock? And for some reason, you could take Intelligence in Tainted Scholar, and you could take Intelligence in Soul Eater. No skills scale off of Intelligence for Warlock. This spell-like ability scales off of Charisma. This is Charisma. This is Charisma. Everything is Charisma. I think Stricken scales off of Intelligence or Charisma, whichever is higher, and that's it. Every other effect in the entirety of Warlock scales off of Charisma. Don't play an Intelligence Warlock, they use Charisma. Your main stats are Charisma, your spell power, and then the DCs to make your spells high, as well as keeping your health high. Also bear in mind, Warlocks wear light armor, so you can wear light armor, and if you're in a Enlightened Spirit, you can wear medium armor. And that's pretty much it. Gear out your Warlock, get the right spell power items, and then start blasting people when you get the chance. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. We will be continuing more about Warlocks and looking into kind of the actual leveling build, and I'll give you guys a recommendation of a leveling build later, but this is enough to get you started with Warlock. Once you start putting some points in, you can even copy this, what I'm doing here, if you like. Once you start putting some points in, it becomes very, very obvious what is good and what is not, and you'll start getting there soon. But like I said, if you're still having trouble, stay tuned for the next Warlock video, where we will talk more specifically about the Warlock build that I'm doing and how to increase the strength of your Warlock in the future. Thanks, bye-bye, have a good day.